Why did the years following the Second Vatican Council see a growth in the Traditionalist movement, which resisted the Reform? And why did this movement explode in popularity during the reign of Pope Francis? In this video, we will examine the history of the trad movement. So, let's get started. We begin with a prayer before the crucifix. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Behold, O good and sweetest Jesus, I cast myself upon my knees in thy sight, and with the most fervent desire of my soul, I pray and beseech thee to impress upon my heart lively sentiments of faith, hope, and charity, with true repentance for my sins, and a most firm desire of amendment. Whilst with deep affection and grief of soul I consider within myself and mentally contemplate thy 5 most precious wounds, having before mine eyes that which David the prophet long ago spoke in thine own person concerning thee, my Jesus. They have pierced my hands and my feet. They have numbered all of my bones. We pray this through Christ our Lord. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. It is a great privilege to study church history with you. Consider liking the video, sharing, all that good stuff. If you're interested in diving deeper into church history, gaining access to the Fundamentals of Theology program, you can join the YouTube channel. Click the join button, become a member of the Scholardium. Also, there's merchandise available. Leave a comment of your definition of traditionalist Catholic. What do you think makes someone a traditionalist Catholic? I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. In this study of the origins of the trad movement, a dynamic force in the church today, in this video we will dive into a topic which has immediate relevance to the present day, which regards the conflicts and divisions in the Catholic Church amongst those Catholics of goodwill who do want to submit to the doctrines of the Catholic Church, the dogmas that have been revealed by Christ, but have different visions about the reform of Vatican II and whether or not it should or shouldn't have taken place. For the most part, the 1969 Missal was accepted with relative ease in most parishes throughout the world. However, not all Catholics were willing to depart with the old order, which was the traditional Latin Mass. After overviewing the philosophical merits of the traditionalist position, we're going to examine a wide variety of traditionalist movements and figures. It will, of course, be difficult to cover all of them adequately, even in a video which will probably be a little bit longer. I will also provide my opinion about the canonical status and the philosophical merits of the particular groups that we'll talk about, which may or may not find themselves at odds with the Vatican at this time. Before we begin talking about the position of the traditionalist Catholic movements, which do believe that the reforms of Vatican II did go too far in simply dismissing or suppressing time-honored Catholic traditions, we need to recognize that even the Novus Ordo Mass is in fact quite traditional when compared with the values and everyday life of most people who do not practice a religion. We all do know, in fact, that when a non-religious person attends a Novus Ordo wedding, the Novus Ordo Mass which they observe would seem to them to be laced with tradition. And this traditional nature of even the Novus Ordo Mass is often quite attractive to secular-minded individuals. In other words, it should be noted that the Novus Ordo reform did not, in fact, dispense with all Catholic tradition. This would be an absurd statement, and to indicate that the Novus Ordo was opposed to tradition in general would be, frankly, hyperbolic. If a secular person were to attend a TLM Mass, they probably would find that to be overtly jarring, or even perhaps utterly medieval. And perhaps a secular person attending a TLM Mass, a TLM marriage, or a TLM funeral might really not even know where to begin with that. And that was the purpose of the Novus Ordo, was to make the Catholic traditional Mass approachable and comprehensible to modern man who had found himself separated from a religious tradition. Now, someone that was raised within the Novus Ordo who understands and appreciates Catholic tradition will often believe that the traditional Latin Mass is, in their opinion, a fuller expression of that tradition. And we've talked all about that throughout this series. But, as I mentioned, the Novus Ordo itself is still perceived as quite traditional to a non-religious person. And that's why it does serve in many cases as a sort of gateway into Catholic tradition. And many people who did grow up in a secular background or perhaps an evangelical Christian background are very attracted to the Novus Ordo, and then after accepting that, find themselves attracted to the traditional Latin Mass. It's also important that none of us place the ridiculous burden of restoring the Church's tradition on our own shoulders. This is, in essence, what we do when we religiously follow church political developments as though we actually were sitting in curial offices and had some sort of influence over them. The Church is not, in fact, a democracy, and us religiously following everything that a pope or a dicastery of the Vatican does on a day-in and day-out basis really doesn't actually impact the direction that the Church heads. We should all recognize that the best way we can positively affect the trajectory of the Church is by ourselves becoming a saint, helping those around us, and in our charge becoming saints, and fulfilling our vocations and our ministries as much as we possibly can. Rome and the hierarchy were filled with scandals throughout the medieval period. How did it then produce so many saints? Perhaps it produced so many saints because Catholics didn't devote themselves towards worrying and obsessing over what was going on in Rome. While this is important, and I'm not saying we should all just turn a blind eye and just be ignorant of what's going on in the Church, ultimately we should recognize that us being aware of political developments in Rome don't affect them. The way that we can affect God's Church positively is by rightly emphasizing our own spiritual lives. And diving into church history is a very important way to do that because it puts us into direct contact with sacred tradition. Religion in and of itself is traditional. The Latin religio means to bind, impose obligations, or show reverence. This word was aptly chosen to describe a given cult in the Roman world. The word cult originally described a system of beliefs or rites of worship to a particular deity. By being bound to the doctrines and moral prescriptions of a religion, we submit our shallow intellects to a tradition that is beyond us and greater than ourselves. We become more when we submit, choosing to draw from the reservoir of wisdom of a religion rather than the limited reservoir of our own personal insights. But we can only submit to a tradition if we acknowledge that we are less than that tradition, and we are incapable of guiding ourselves to the shores of a righteous and holy life. Religion is inherently traditional because the soul seeks to submit herself to a tradition being handed on to her. The Latin tradere means deliver, and to be traditional means to accept what was delivered to us. By letting go of our personal, our generational, or our cultural distinctions, we are able to become happily lost in the greater tradition that endures of a particular religion, namely the true one, hopefully, as opposed to clinging to that which, quote, like the grass, quickly fades, see Psalm 37. Religion further binds us to our ancestors who shared our faith. This is not an inconsequential or nostalgic side effect in Christianity, but being bound to the faith of our fathers is an expression of the perennial truth that as all are in Christ, all are one in him, see Galatians 3:28. Catholicism is especially traditional amongst the world's religions, because its theological epistemology, or method of knowing that something truly is true, asserts that Christ and the Holy Spirit revealed the fullness of divine revelation to the 12 apostles before the death of St. John. Therefore, to innovate the faith which was handed on in totality to the apostles is to adulterate it. While evolutions in the precision of articulating timeless truths and liturgical practice can authentically develop in the Church's tradition, the dogmas or the defined core beliefs of Catholicism cannot be changed without becoming less or becoming infused with error. Therefore, fluency in church history and in tradition is necessary to become a doctrinally conscientious Catholic in general. Generally, members of a religion long for an ethos of tradition, or a sort of culture of traditionalism, because it is intuited by members of this religion that such a, quote, vibe of traditionalism facilitates humility and piety. If a religion is the binding of one's soul, intellect, and moral life to a tradition greater than ourselves, this sort of submission is best facilitated by a religion which has the culture which imbues a sense that the practice of this religion is old and even somewhat foreign to oneself. Praying with archaic language, such as using the word art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, almost every other word in the Our Father and the Hail Mary are archaic Shakespearean English, or even praying in Latin, is a substantial reminder as we pray that our spiritual lives and the wisdom tradition we engage with is not to be bent to accommodate our unique ways of speaking and framing reality, but we rather are to bend toward it. To insist that one's faith be accommodated entirely for our sensibilities, our ways of speaking, our ways of understanding right and wrong, and our understanding of wisdom, in essence, is a desire to morph our religion into a mirror, rather than a portal, to that which transcends ourselves, namely, the will and the knowledge and wisdom of God. Of course, cultural responsivity is also an element of a living tradition. The Church's worship has always made room for practices of popular piety to be integrated into it. The prayers at the foot of the altar, as well as the last gospel, likely began as devotional elements which emerged organically in medieval culture and came to adorn the rites of the Mass. Thus, while the premises of an aggiornamento, which was Vatican II's main goal, to in a measured manner reform the Church's practices, to sort of respond more to the dramatically different cultural developments since the Industrial Revolution, the central premises of this reform did make sense after the Enlightenment's academic and political revolutions and the industrial and capitalist economic revolutions radically reshaped Western civilization and values and attitudes to little resemble the traditional medieval values of Christendom. It made sense for the Church's hierarchy to oversee an aggiornamento of the Church's practice after the 1960s. However, the manner in which this reform was carried out by pastors and bishops throughout the world did dispense too recklessly with tradition. And if we need evidence of that, we need to look no farther than the plethora of traditionalist movements and the many Catholics who are drawn towards these movements. There is in fact a sense amongst many Catholics that they have been orphaned from our Roman patrimony by the Vatican II reform. So even while the Vatican II reform was based on valid premises, and even while the documents of Vatican II do not contain heresy, and I will look at the claims of heresy in a minute, a few minutes, it's going to be later in the video. Regardless, the manner in which the Vatican II constitutions and declarations were implemented throughout the Church did in fact create so-called parish orphans who long for a return to the traditions which seemed to have been suppressed after Vatican II. The grave charge that the implementers of Vatican II seem to have failed to have adequately balanced tradition with reform is not a mere conjecture. In this series, we have chronicled this failure to balance reform with tradition extensively with no lack of evidence. Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI himself, bemoaned in Principles of Theology the sense that many bishops had during the Kennedy era that a sort of 0 hour was across the West, and even the Church's institutions and spirituality could be radically reborn, forgetting all that came before. A number of liturgists expressed outright animosity towards traditional Catholic piety in articles and trade books in the 1960s and 70s. Lucien Deis, one of the Concilium and then the Congregation of Divine Worship's musical consultors, said that traditional sacred chant would cause parishes to perish in boredom, while Father Warren Roos, OFM, said that the Church's traditional dogmatic belief that the Mass was a representation of Christ's death on Mount Calvary was absurd. You can learn more about these writers who had this outright animosity towards Catholic traditional liturgy and even expressed heresies in expressing their animosity in my videos on the 1960s and 1970s Catholic literature, which was not, it was in fact often published with nihil obstats, so approval from bishops. I do not actually have the thumbnails to the right. Bishops' candidates for the permanent diaconates and seminarians would revolt in the 1970s against the Church's tradition of minor orders with little substantial reason. Priests began to construct their own Eucharistic anaphoras to better suit their theological opinions, deeming that the Roman canon was insufficient, and the same priests and bishops would approve of the administration of communion in the hand, deeming the traditional mode of the reception of the Most Holy Sacrament to be too culturally awkward to continue, even while Pope Paul VI demanded this in his motu proprio Memoriale Domini. The cult of man, in general, became a sort of implicit attitude of many Catholic parishes. Many priests seem to have overinflated the importance of cultural responsivity in the Mass, and conducted Masses which grossly subjectivized its purpose to the interests of lay people. Child Masses, which took the liturgy and bent it to the supposed comprehensibility of small children. Clown Masses, which emphasized people's both like of clowns and also people's desire to feel carefree and whimsical during Mass. Automobile masses, which even drove vehicles through the central aisle of the church. Polka masses, which sort of deified Polish dance music and just Slovak dance music in general. American football masses, with cheerleaders cheering throughout the Mass. Renaissance and Revel masses. All of these masses, which became popular in the early parts of the 1970s, sort of had the attitude that the Mass is a gift to man to entertain rather than a gift to God. Simply put, if the reform of the 1960s had been implemented properly, and had in fact adequately balanced Catholic tradition with needed reforms, there would not be such a vibrant and growing traditionalist movement today. To be sure, any reform of the Mass might have led to the formation of some of the world's 1 billion Catholics to gather and resist the changes. There was inevitably going to be some people that did not like any reforms or updates to the Mass. Yet today, there is not simply a fringe minority of Catholics who long for a return to the pre-Vatican II traditions. The existence of a number of rapidly growing traditionalist orders and societies, such as the Institute of Christ the King and Sovereign Priest, the Fraternal Society of St. Peter, the Canons Regular, who have an affinity towards the traditional Latin Mass but don't exclusively celebrate it, the Friars of the Immaculate, who have been a bit persecuted since 2013, and more, as well as SSPX, the SSPX, and friaries and monastic establishments under the SSPX umbrella, and different sedevacantist societies, indicate that a great deal of people who want to celebrate the Catholic faith have rightly perceived that the Vatican II reform has gone too far in its dismissal of tradition. That is not a criticism, again, of the conciliar documents themselves, but in the manner in which pastors and bishops implemented the reform. Many viewers of this channel who are in fact largely supportive of Vatican II and do primarily attend the Novus Ordo have also indicated in comment sections and on polls that they would be pleased if many traditions of the TLM were restored in the ordinary expression of the Church's order of prayer, such as priests publicly wearing collars more often, and religious orders publicly wearing habits, a restoration of a number of reverent gestures and prayers, which were omitted from the Novus Ordo, to be restored, for Latin to be more regularly prayed throughout the liturgy, and for a restoration of sacred chant to be the preeminent form of sacred music in the Church's liturgy. Now, there are some issues with traditionalism, as many have also pointed out. Many traditionalists seem to have succumbed to the vice of excess or disproportionate disdain for the Novus Ordo. As mentioned, the Novus Ordo is still typically rightly perceived as quite traditional by an individual from a secular background, because it does in fact maintain the skeleton or the corpus, the main body of Catholic tradition and the liturgy is in fact maintained in the Novus Ordo, even while many of its devotional adornments have been removed, sadly. Further, because many traditionalists have come to the scandalizing conclusion, even perhaps against their will, that the magisterium is not infallible in each of its ordinary decisions, which is of course has always been true, many traditionalists have swung to an attitude hovering near the attitude of the Greek Orthodox, an attitude which asserts that the Pope may be the legitimate successor of St. Peter, and in theory the bishops in communion with him constitutes the magisterium. However, because many of these traditionalists believe that the magisterium and the Pope is so mistaken about so many important matters, many do not really seem to accept his authority outright, but sift through all ordinary expressions of the magisterium to determine which of their decrees seem prudent to themselves. Such an attitude places a particular traditionalist as the sort of ultimate arbitrator of truth even above the magisterium, and this ultimately leads to the same sort of disorder within the traditionalist movement as we see at the end of the book of Judges, where we read, "In those days Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes." We must, however, defer to the rulings of the magisterium on all matters of faith and morals, whenever doing so is logically and morally possible, not merely when we come to the same conclusion as the magisterium. While respectful and measured dissent is possible in response to ordinary acts of the magisterium, it is always a grave and serious matter to have any disagreements with the magisterium, and it is always spiritually dangerous, and basically to disagree with the magisterium and dissent from a decision of them is to stand on the very precipice of the deadly sin of pride, even if not to automatically step over it. Traditionalism, further, today, is untraditional. If a millennial or a Gen Z or a so-called Gen Alpha Catholic decides that they're going to reject that tradition which was handed on by the boomer pastors they grew up with, they are not benefiting from the humility that we gain when we simply humbly submit to what was given to us. Rebelling against our parents' values has become a sort of rite of passage for adolescents, leading some adolescents to turn towards re-embracing the traditional values that our parents or grandparents, by and large, rejected. This is how you can have traditionalist podcasts, which are called The Resistance, or The Retrogrades. It's sort of ironic that you have traditionalist movements, which are identifying themselves as rebels. The word revolt is the same root as we see in revolution. The danger in being a revolutionary is that in rejecting what was passed on by our immediate generational predecessors, even when this is necessary, because, if you have if you have parents who, let's say, grew up in the 1960s and that was their coming of age decade, well, their generation was the generation that ushered in the sexual revolution. And our pastors oftentimes were kind of coming of age as pastors during that same period and may or may not have done certain actions to kind of help out with the sexual revolution. Unfortunately, that's a reality. There are a lot of pastors who sort of went along with that and stopped teaching sound moral Catholic doctrine as regarded sexual morality. So unfortunately, many of us have to decide, I cannot accept what my parents or what my pastor in the parish I grew up with is handing on to me because it's missing key elements of the perennial Catholic tradition. But when we choose to reject part or whole of that culture or attitude toward Catholicism which has been handed on to us, we're simply not capable of capitalizing on the benefit of humble filial acceptance of that which has been handed on. When we feel that we must judicially discern each value of our parents or of our pastors and decide for ourselves which of these values we should retain in order to humbly submit to the Catholic tradition, we are again susceptible to the sin of pride, which is most born from choosing for ourselves and deeming our own discernment to be our guide rather than merely submitting to that which was handed on. This would seem to be the reason that Catholic traditionalists and conservatives, many of which have embraced some measure of rebellion against that which has been handed on to us, which is in many cases an adulterated version of Catholicism, the so-called progressive or lukewarm or cafeteria Catholicism, which many of us were taught growing up, are often so chronically opinionated, and by extension, arrogant. In general, it's good to not have that many opinions. The first major act of resistance to the Novus Ordo, however, did not occur from a millennial who was rejecting that sort of deformed Catholicism which was handed on to them by parents who had embraced the progressive vision of Catholicism, which does not accept Catholic dogma in totality. The first major act of resistance to the Novus Ordo was not a critique even of the Missal itself, but was rather a critique of the general instructions of the Roman Missal, called the Germ, which accompanied the new Mass. This inaugural act of resistance by the newly forming Catholic Traditionalist movement was levied first by Cardinals Alfredo Ottaviani, who we've talked about in the Vatican II videos, and Antonio Bacci. As a reminder, Ottaviani was the senior prelate whose microphone was shut off when he was vehemently opposing the Sacrosanctum Concilium constitution on the council floor. Both of these cardinals signed a document which was written by a group of traditionalist theologians. It was titled A Short Critical Study of the New Order of the Mass, but has come to be called the Ottaviani Intervention. The text was originally intended to be a private letter to the Pope with the signatures of a number of high-ranking bishops and cardinals. But the plan was, if the Pope did not respond to the letter within a certain measure of time, the letter was going to be made public. However, one of the handlers of this document, which was being spread around to try to gain signatures, ended up publishing the document before Ottaviani and Bacci had even presented it to the Pope on September 25, 1969, before the Novus Ordo was promulgated. While this premature publication may have done much to generate an enthusiasm for a traditionalist resistance to the new Missal, which had not even yet been promulgated, it also prevented St. Paul VI from seriously considering Ottaviani's concerns, since it was easily perceived as a challenge to his authority, the document being published before he even had the ability to address it. Additionally, of the alleged dozen cardinals who had originally planned to sign the document, only Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani and Cardinal Antonio Bacci ended up signing the document after it was prematurely published and perceived as a threat to the Pope's authority. The Ottaviani intervention opened by referring to the new Mass as the Novus Ordo Missal. Thus, the term Novus Ordo as a proper noun for the new Mass had caught on even before its promulgation. The document's central concern was that, quote, the Novus Ordo represents, both as a whole and in its details, a striking departure from the Catholic theology of the Mass as it was formulated by Session 22 of the Council of Trent. End quote. He wrote that these changes, quote, had every possibility of satisfying the most modernist of Protestants, end quote. The text then criticized the germ for referring to the Mass as, quote, the Lord's Supper, rather than as a sacrifice. The germ was also criticized for referring to the change of the bread and wine into the body and blood and soul and divinity of Christ as a spiritual change rather than a substantial change, blurring the line between Protestant and Catholic sacramental theology. The writers also took issue with the Novus Ordo's suppression of prayers, which explicitly referenced belief in the real presence, and for introducing new prayers, such as the new offertory prayers, which seemed to diminish such beliefs. Interestingly, the authors argued that the reform would alienate Eastern Christians, since the new missal was an implicit repudiation of their liturgical customs, which certainly held more in common with the traditional Latin Mass than with the Novus Ordo, which again they believed was designed to satisfy the most modernist of Protestants. This point cleverly framed their criticism of the Novus Ordo as counterproductive to the post-conciliar pursuit of ecumenical unity with the so-called Orthodox. A point-by-point examination of the Novus Ordo, this is a quote from the Ottaviani intervention, a point-by-point examination of the Novus Ordo reveals changes so great that they confirm the judgment already made on the standard Mass. For on many points it has much to gladden the heart of even the most modernist of Protestants. Quite a bold claim that the Novus Ordo was sort of implicitly designed to satisfy modernist Protestants. Of course, Pope Paul VI is not going to take lightly or take kindly to that sort of a criticism. Was it perhaps framed in an overly inflammatory way? If you really want Pope Paul VI to make certain changes, might it be better to try to affirm some elements you like? Just pragmatically speaking. It's not dishonest to try to find some things you can agree with in order to then suggest a few reforms. And maybe they had already done that behind closed doors. It's hard to say. Now, there were actually some changes to the general instruction of the Roman Missal. References to the Lord's Supper were replaced by references to the Mass, and references to a spiritual change of the elements were changed to a substantial change to better reflect Catholic sacramental theology. Let's look at the separation of the Wanderer magazine from the Remnant magazine. The disagreements over Vatican II, which has divided the Matt family for the past 60-some years, is the best example which illustrates how the nature of the reform has divided those brothers in Christ, in general, who seek fidelity to Mother Church. In this example, actual brothers were divided. Walter Matt, the once editor of The Wanderer, was divided from Alphonse Matt, his brother, and subsequently their children have been divided on opposite sides of these magazines, which have been rivals throughout the decades, but are in fact run by the same family. The periodical, originally titled Der Wanderer, was founded in 1867 in Minnesota in order to educate German Catholic immigrants in the United States in their traditional Catholic heritage, in opposition to the secular ideas of the German Enlightenment. The editorship of the newspaper was eventually given to a young, zealous traditional Catholic named Joseph Matt, who led the publication from 1899 all the way until 1964. In 1926, Joseph Matt was made a Knight of St. Gregory by Pope Pius XI in recognition to his service to the Church. In the 1930s, Joseph Matt began publishing the newspaper in English, writing for a traditional Catholic audience in general rather than for an exclusively German readership. He chose his son Walter Matt to continue the publication after his retirement. Tensions began to mount, however, between Walter and his brother Alphonse, who also worked on the periodical, as the changes surrounding the Second Vatican Council led to the general reform of the Missal. Walter Matt believed, quote, the prospect of a new Mass would prove disastrous for the Church. But Alphonse Matt, his brother, urged loyalty to the Pope in whatever liturgical decrees he proclaimed. Whereas Walter Matt believed that the impending changes to the liturgy were going to be devastating to traditional Catholic worship, Al Matt took the position that while he, quote, did express some reservations about the extent and character of the reforms, he defended the authority of St. Paul VI over the liturgy. End quote. As a result of these tensions, Walter Matt left his editorship of The Wanderer and formed The Remnant in 1968, as the United States' first traditionalist Catholic newspaper. Alphonse Matt then went on to be the head editor of The Wanderer, taking up the conservative Catholic position of defending the magisterium's decisions as a matter of principle when attacked by either progressive Catholics or traditionalist Catholics such as his own brother. The remnant, however, would go on criticizing both progressive clergy and scholars as well as the magisterium, when the magisterium made decisions which the remnant editors believed were contradictory to former conclusions made by the magisterium before the Second Vatican Council. The Remnant, in 1972, Walter Matt began including articles in The Remnant written by Michael Davies, an English traditionalist, and Archbishop Lefebvre, exposing Americans to the work of both of these writers. And this is in part why Lefebvre's second seminary was actually built in Michigan, and Michael Davies would also be a very influential writer in the United States. Neither the Remnant nor the Wanderer shied away from criticizing one another's editorials and articles. In the early 2000s, the chapters of Ferrara and Wood's Traditionalist Manifesto, The Great Facade, were originally composed as a series of articles published in the Remnant magazine in response to a critical review published in The Wanderer against Michael Matt, Walter Matt's son's, traditionalist essay, We Resist You. In general, the Remnant writers have had a favorable attitude toward the SSPX, while the Wanderer writers have had a more critical attitude. Let us now turn our attention to the SSPX and its origins. Not all traditionalists are united in support for the SSPX. It seems that probably most traditionalist Catholics have a favorable attitude toward the SSPX, but a good deal of traditionalist attitudes do in fact regard the SSPX as schismatic. It's a very important topic that we should not take lightly. We should thoroughly investigate the claims of schism in order to understand whether or not that's an appropriate term to describe the Society of St. Pius X. So, in their origins, distressed by the trends in the French Pontifical University in 1970, 11 French seminarians asked Lefebvre if he could help them find a more traditional seminary to attend. It should be noted that legitimate theological heterodoxy was in fact infecting seminaries during this time, and it's a wonder that any priests at all were able to get through the seminary systems of the 1970s without accepting certain errors. Many seminary rectors, even it seems, denied Catholics who held on to the traditional orthodoxy of our fathers. The book Good by Good Men chronicles a seminarian who was denied repeatedly by different seminaries for being too rigid, which was a sign of being psychologically damaged, which, as we'll look at later, Pope Francis even seems to have echoed that idea. And so this sort of psychological illness of rigidity was used to actually prevent faithful Catholic men from entering the seminary in so many seminaries in the 1970s. Responding to this legitimate need, then, which should be recognized as a legitimate crisis in the seminary system, Lefebvre directed these seminarians to the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. Later, these seminarians, as well as the abbots of the Haute-Rive Abbey and the Dominican theologian Father Marie-Dominique Philippe, asked if Lefebvre might teach the seminarians himself. At this time, however, he was 64 years old and was content in retirement. However, when the seminarians obtained permission to form a traditional priestly society, he agreed to be its shepherd. It must be noted, then, that for the first 6 years of SSPX foundation, it was a canonically licit pious union, which had obtained an ad experimentum, or provisional status, which was set to expire in 1976. By 1976, the Holy See was going to rule whether or not the society might enjoy permanent recognition at the diocesan level. Lefebvre lobbied for an official recognition before this period ended by other heads of curial departments which he believed might look at his movement favorably. He anticipated that his traditional society would not find support from either Paul VI or the Vatican Secretary of State. The French bishops in general were critical of Lefebvre's seminary in Switzerland, stating that its priests, who were trained exclusively in the TLM, were not to be incarnated in any one of their dioceses. Meanwhile, Lefebvre opened 2 more seminaries, one in Armada, Michigan, and one in Rome in 1974. By 1975, the new bishop with jurisdiction over the Equine Seminary in Switzerland, Bishop Pierre Momy, who was appointed shortly after the society had been formed, was not in favor of giving the society canonical legitimacy, and he had rocky memories of Lefebvre during debates held with him concerning religious liberty at Vatican II. An apostolic visitation was set up from Rome to visit the seminary in mid-November of 1974. While the report was not necessarily harsh, the priests who were sent from Rome to examine the seminary scandalized the society members by supposedly liberal theological opinions. It's not exactly clear what they had said during the visitation that scandalized the seminarians. Ultimately, this scandal led to the drafting of Lefebvre's declaration, which was published, either leaked against or according to his wishes, on November 21st, 1974. After this, the Society's provisional status was officially revoked on May 6, 1975. In October of 1976, Paul VI personally wrote to Marcel Lefebvre after having a private audience with him in September 11th of the previous year. Lefebvre would ultimately publish the letter sent by Pope Paul VI, as well as publish what he said had happened during his private audience with the Pope. These are excerpts from the Lefebvre Declaration, which serves as the sort of founding document of SSPX. Let's look at these quotations from the Lefebvre Declaration of SSPX to try to understand what sent the SSPX on the trajectory it ended up going on in the late 70s and then the 80s toward irregular canonical status. So Lefebvre said, "We hold fast with all our heart and with all our soul to Catholic Rome, the guardian of the Catholic faith and of the traditions necessary to preserve this faith, to eternal Rome, mistress of wisdom and truth. We refuse, on the other hand, and have always refused, to follow the Rome of the neo-modernist and neo-Protestant tendencies which were clearly evident in the Second Vatican Council and after the Council in all the reforms which issued from it." So a universal statement that all the reforms issuing from Vatican II are imbued with neo-modernist and neo-Protestant tendencies. There's a distinction here made by Lefebvre between the eternal Rome, which is basically saying Rome before Vatican II, and the Rome of the neo-modernist and neo-Protestant tendencies. And he's saying we are refusing to follow the Rome of the neo-modernist and neo-Protestant tendencies. It's a bit of hyperbolic language. The declarations actually said from Rome really are not, they shouldn't be described as being modernist or Protestant, even if vague language and inadequate articulation of the reforms did lead to modernist and Protestant implementations. Regardless, what's key here is that he's saying, I'm refusing to follow basically the present authority of the Catholic Church. I'm refusing to follow the Rome of the neo-modernist and neo-Protestant tendencies. All these reforms, all of them, without exception, which is in general not a good way to speak, all these reforms indeed have contributed and are still contributing to the destruction of the Church, to the ruin of the priesthood, to the abolition of the sacrifice of the Mass and of the sacraments, to the disappearance of religious life, to a naturalist and Teilhardian teaching in universities, seminaries, and catechetics, a teaching derived from liberalism and Protestantism, many times condemned by the solemn magisterium of the Church. There are legitimate issues happening here that Lefebvre is responding to. There is, in fact, a grave crisis in the 1970s, which I titled my last video, The Full Flowering of Modernism. The darkest hour of the Church is the 1970s. He's attributing this dark hour to Vatican II in general, or from the papacy in general, it seems, which is the position that's going to get him into trouble. He says, no authority, not even the highest in the hierarchy, can force us to abandon or diminish our Catholic faith, so clearly expressed and professed by the Church's magisterium for 19 centuries. And then he quotes St. Paul saying, whether an angel from heaven preach a gospel to you besides that which we have preached to you, let him be anathema. He goes on, specifically condemning Paul VI, saying, is it not these errors, that the Holy Father is repeating to us today? And if we can discern a certain contradiction in his words and deeds, as well as in those of the dicasteries, well, we choose what was always taught, and we turn a deaf ear to the novelties destroying the Church, encouraging turning a deaf ear towards the Pope. Condemning the Novus Ordo. It is impossible to modify profoundly the lex orandi without modifying the lex credendi. The way of prayer cannot be modified without modifying the way of belief. To the Novus Ordo Missae correspond a new catechism, a new priesthood, new seminaries, a charismatic Pentecostal church, all things opposed to orthodoxy and the perennial teachings of the Church. So he's saying you can't have the Novus Ordo without having a completely new priesthood. You can't have a Novus Ordo without basically dismissing the traditional Catholic priesthood and the traditional constitution of the Church in general, which it might have seemed that way in the 1970s. By zeroing in on that moment in history, that was the hour in which the Church's institutions were falling, and you might have said, why is this happening? Because of the Novus Ordo. However, things stabilized clearly after the reign of John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, indicating that this hypothesis that the Novus Ordo could not exist with a Church which still embraced its traditions it was an incorrect hypothesis. He said Catholics must presently refuse to submit to Rome. He said this reformation, born of liberalism and modernism, this reformation being the Vatican II reforms, is poisoned through and through. It derives from heresy and ends in heresy, even if all its acts are not formally heretical. It is therefore impossible for any conscientious and faithful Catholic to espouse this reformation or accept Vatican II, or submit to it in any way whatsoever. So he said it's impossible for any conscientious and faithful Catholic to submit to the present magisterium. He said the only attitude of faithfulness to the Church and Catholic doctrine in view of our salvation is a categorical refusal to accept, basically, the Vatican II reformation. That is I, without any spirit of rebellion, bitterness, or resentment. We pursue our work of forming priests with the timeless magisterium, rejecting the actual magisterium's authority, that is, as our guide. I added the insert there. We are persuaded that we can render no greater service to the Holy Catholic Church, to the Sovereign Pontiff, and to posterity. So he's responding to legitimate crises, but it's a very strong statement, which does demand, it says no Catholic can be a Catholic without rejecting the reforms of the present magisterium. Of course he's going to get in trouble for saying such things. He writes, again, these are from his sermons given to the convent of Fongiaux in the summer of 1976, which immediately preceded his private audience with Pope Paul VI. He said that Vatican II, especially Gloriam et Spes, sought, quote, to marry the Church and the revolution of the modern culture. He said this adulterous union can only produce bastards, and the rite of the Mass is a bastard rite, and the sacraments are bastard sacraments. This is truly incredible, he says. Those who remain faithful to their constitutions, faithful to the Catholic Church, faithful to the religious life, are considered no longer nuns. He was speaking to a group of suppressed traditionalist nuns. While those who, on the contrary, abandon the religious life and lead a worldly life are still considered nuns. The suppression, of course, maybe during Pope Francis's reign, there was suppression of orders that were simply traditional. At this time, the suppression of societies like SSPX are because of things that we just read in the Declaration. They're not merely for traditionalism. He told a parable which you may find interesting. He said, imagine a 5-year-old who might know that their bishop was teaching something contrary to his catechism. If he corrected the bishop, it would not be the 5-year-old judging the bishop, but the catechism. So he's basically saying we're simply showing how the present magisterium is saying different things than the magisterium of the quote-unquote eternal Rome. And of course, Marcel Lefebvre is raising genuine points. There is, in fact, a crisis in orthodoxy in the 1970s. It is the dark hour of the Church. But, of course, he's also demanding all faithful Catholics basically not obey the present magisterium, reject Vatican II, which is an expression of the magisterium of all bishops in communion with the Pope, and rejecting the reforms of the Pope in general in order to be faithful to tradition, and this is not exactly a Catholic position. So Pope Paul VI calls him in September 11th to conference with him at Castel Gandolfo. We only have the transcript of this discussion from SSPX sources, so we should keep that in mind. The meeting begins, again, according to these sources. I'm not going to keep repeating that, but how reliable exactly are they? That's definitely up for debate. Paul VI says, I hoped to find before me a brother, a son, a friend. Unfortunately, the position you have taken up is that of an anti-pope. It goes beyond all measure in its words, because it does not have a measured criticism of the Pope or of the Reform. It's a complete criticism. It said we have to reject it wholesale. We have to reject the revolution wholesale. In its words, actions, and general attitude. The issue here is not the person, it is the Pope, and you have judged the Pope to be unfaithful to the faith of which he is the supreme guarantor. This may be the first time in history that this has happened. You have told the entire world that the Pope does not have the faith, that he does not have belief, that he is a modernist, and so on. Of course, I myself must remain humble, but you have placed yourself in a terrible situation. You have accomplished extremely serious actions before the eyes of the world. Now, Lefebvre, according to the SSPX sources I have linked above, admitted that his words may have erred in taking too accusational of a tone against the person of the Pope himself. However, there was never a repudiation of a specific statement in the declaration. Lefebvre responded that the situation is such that we do not know what to do. You're acting with lots of certainty. With all these changes, either we risk losing the faith, or we have to give the impression of disobeying. I would like to fall on my knees and accept everything, but I cannot go against my conscience. It is not I who have created the movement. It is the faithful who are torn and do not accept certain situations. I am not the leader of the Traditionalists. I am a bishop, who, torn by what is happening, has tried to form priests as he did before the council. I am behaving exactly as I did before the council. I therefore cannot understand how I am all of a sudden condemned because I form priests in obedience to the healthy tradition of the Holy Church. And he's not being condemned for that. He's not even being condemned at all at this point, but he's being criticized for telling Catholics they must reject the neo-modernist Rome. He went on saying, many priests and faithful believe that it is difficult to accept the tendencies that began after the Ecumenical Council Vatican II on the liturgy, religious freedom, the formation of priests, the relations between the Church and Catholic governments, the Church's relations with Protestants. They do not understand how all these things that are being promoted can be in keeping with the healthy tradition of the Church. I insist I am not the only one who thinks this. Groups have formed, and they urge me not to abandon them. I seek to form priests according to the faith and in the faith. I suffer terribly at the sight of other seminaries. There are unimaginable situations. Religious faithful to their habits are condemned and despised by their bishop, while those who live a secular life and behave like people of the world are accepted. Paul VI responded, we are the first to regret these excesses. We are the first and most determined to resolve them. But the remedy cannot lie in defying the authority of the Church. I have written this to you several times, but you have paid no heed. Lefebvre then made a number of requests to the Pope, rather than capitulations, requesting for churches to be granted where the traditional Latin Mass could be prayed. Pope Paul VI responded that we are a community, we cannot allow independence in behavior in a diocese. We can't have some churches having the TLM, others having the Novus Ordo. That was certainly Paul VI's opinion. Lefebvre then said, well, the council admits of pluralism, why can't this principle apply to traditionalists within the Church? He said, I would be ready to submit, but you need to provide for the traditionalists who long for the TLM. Paul VI then said, how can you consider yourself in communion with us, using the third person pronoun to describe his office, an honorific use of language, when you take up a position against us in the eyes of the world to accuse me of unfaithfulness and of wanting to destroy the Church? You have said it and you have written it. I am a modernist pope. By implementing an ecumenical council, I am betraying the Church. You understand that if this was the case, I should resign and invite you to take my place and direct the Church. Lefebvre simply responded, the crisis of the Church is there. Paul VI responded to that, we suffer deeply from it. You have helped make it worse with your manifest disobedience, with your open defiance of the Pope. Lefebvre argued that he was being unjustly judged, but then Pope Paul VI responded, canon law judges you. Do you realize the scandal and the harm you have done to the Church? Are you not aware of it? Would you be capable of standing before God like this? Examine your conscience and ask yourself before God what you should do. Lefebvre responded, if you would but allow the TLM in isolated chapels, everything would work out. As I've said, I'm not the leader of a movement. I'm ready to stay locked up in my seminary forever. People contact my priests and they are edified. And he's affirming that they are doing good work. SSPX is, in fact, doing good work. There's a lot of good things happening here because they are being faithful to tradition at a time period in which many seminaries, likely most seminaries, virtually all seminaries, were not. And so, yes, their priests are going to have a lot of, they have been really well formed in the Catholic faith, but the ecclesiology, it seems, is deficient. The meeting ends. Lefebvre said, do you know that in France there are at least 14 different canons or Eucharistic prayers used for the Eucharistic prayer? Paul VI responded, no, not 14, about 100. There are abuses, but the council is doing much good. I do not wish to justify everything. Like I said, I am seeking to correct what needs correcting. But we also have to admit that there are signs, thanks to the council, of a strong spiritual renewal among the youth, an increase in the sense of responsibility among the faithful, or the empowering of the laity, the priests and the bishops. Archbishop Lefebvre says, I do not say that everything is negative. I too would like to collaborate in the building of the Church. Not everything about Vatican II is negative, he says. Previously he said the council had to be rejected wholesale in the declaration as we just read. Paul VI said, but it is certainly not in this way that you will help to build the Church. But do you realize what you are doing? Are you aware that you are going directly against the Church, the Pope, and the Council? How can you claim the right to judge the Council? A Council, after all, whose acts for the most part were signed by you. I have recognized your merit, and at the Council we agreed on many things. Lefebvre said, this is true. Paul VI said, you understand that I cannot allow you to make yourself guilty of a schism even for reasons that you consider personal. Make a public declaration in which you retract your recent declaration and your behavior, that the entire world has understood as acts not meant to build the Church, but to divide and harm her. We must find unity in prayer and reflection. Lefebvre ultimately would not retract the declaration, but they would conclude their meeting with a Pater Noster, Ave Maria, and Veni Sancte Spiritus. Paul VI argued that there were in fact positive fruits of Vatican II. Were there in fact signs of a strong spiritual renewal among the youth, an increase in the sense of responsibility among the faithful, the priests, and the bishops? Now, of course, attention to the abuses and progressive revolts against tradition in the 1960s and 70s does dominate the historiography of this period in Catholic history. My own videos on these 2 decades were titled Progressive Catholicism Goes Off the Rails for the 60s and The Full Flowering of Modernism for the 70s. There is good reason that this is the typical way we address these periods in church history. And today, it does seem difficult to find in Vatican II immediate signs of renewal amongst the youth, since the youth seem to apostatize in droves after they leave their parents' supervision when they go off to college. In the wake of Vatican II, however, Pope Paul VI was referring to the great deal of lay programs which were instituted, which gained a great degree of participation of lay faithful, particularly the young, in service projects, Bible studies, and young adult faith-based groups in general. These groups, again, however, were not exactly free from heterodox opinions, and perhaps Pope Paul VI is referring to these groups in a sort of rose-tinted window. Declining mass attendance is starkly apparent after Vatican II, especially in the United States. But in Europe, numbers continued after Vatican II on their pre-Vatican II trajectory. In the United States, the declining mass attendance during the 1960s and 70s could also be processed as what was going to happen as the second and third generations of the rural immigrants from Europe settled into urban consumerist lifestyles in America. Our nation ultimately began to resemble the mass attendance trajectories of European nations. While declining mass attendance after Vatican II is certainly not a positive aspect of the reform, it is to some extent difficult to say with certainty if declining mass attendance was due to the reform or due to the even more dramatic cultural shifts after 1960, which, following the lead of Marxist ideology, rejected religion in general. Let's examine Pope Paul VI's letter, which was sent to Lefebvre after reflections on their private audience. He wrote in his letter, "After we received you in audience on last September 11th at Castel Gandolfo, we let you freely express your position and your desires, even though the various aspects of your case were already well known to us personally. The memory that we still have of your zeal for the faith and the apostolate, as well as the good you have accomplished in the past at the service of the Church, made us and still makes us hope that you will once again become an edifying subject in full ecclesial communion." So here's an indication that he's not currently in full ecclesial communion, according to Paul VI. "After the particularly serious actions that you have performed, we have once more asked you to reflect before God concerning your duty. It is true that we have before us your letter of September 16th, in which you affirm, quote, 'A common point unites us, the ardent desire to see the cessation of all the abuses that disfigure the churches. How I wish to collaborate in this salutary work with your holiness and under your authority, so that the Church may recover her true countenance.'" End quote. How must these words, to which your response is limited, in which in themselves are positive, be interpreted? You speak as if you have forgotten your scandalous words and gestures about ecclesial communion, that is, in his declaration, words and gestures which you have never retracted, even though Paul VI told him to do so. You do not explicitly express your acceptance of the authority of the Second Vatican Council and of the Holy See, and this constitutes the basis of the problem. You continue in those personal works of yours which the legitimate authority has expressly ordered you to suspend, that is, leading the society. Ambiguity results from the duplicity of your language. In practice, you put yourself forward as the defender and spokesman of the faithful of priests, who are torn apart by what is happening in the Church, thus giving the sad impression that the Catholic faith and the essential values of tradition are not sufficiently respected and lived in a portion of the people of God, at least in certain countries. Frankly, that's true during the 1970s. So Lefebvre would be right about that. But in your interpretation of the facts and in the particular role that you assign yourself, as well as in the way in which you accomplish this role, there is something that misleads the people of God and deceives souls of goodwill who are justly desirous of fidelity and of spiritual and apostolic progress. Deviations in the faith or in sacramental practice are certainly very grave, wherever they occur. For a long period of time, they have been the object of our full doctrinal and pastoral attention. Certainly one must not forget the positive signs of spiritual renewal or of increased responsibility in a good number of Catholics, or the complexity of the cause of the crisis. The immense change in today's world affects believers at the edge of their being, and renders ever more necessary apostolic concern for those who are far away. Paul VI is recognizing you're attributing all the crises in the Church in the 60s and 70s to Vatican II, rather than the sociological crises which are causing cultural revolutions in every institution, in every society, and in every traditional cultural attitude throughout the entire planet. These cultural revolutions were not only happening in Christendom, but throughout the world in 1960. As kind of the baby boomer post-war generation was coming of age, there was in fact a widespread revolt against tradition in general, which was typically aligned with Marxist ideology and was perhaps in part caused by the infiltration of educational institutions by agents of the Comintern, which were sent by the Soviet Union in order to destabilize traditional Western values. And so the attribution of the crisis in the church as though this was an isolated crisis in the 1960s global cultures, okay, if only the church was having crisis and not every other institution of Western civilization, then yes, maybe it would be reasonable to say, well, what happened here? Probably Vatican II. But in fact, the crisis happening in the church is mirroring the exact sort of crises that are happening throughout the entire Western world at this time. And because the entire Western world is drifting farther and farther away from religion and towards atheism, Pope Paul VI says this is more evidence that we do need to implement the reforms of Vatican II. While the traditionalism of the SSPX is attractive to faithful Catholics, it's typically not attractive towards secular atheistic people. And Vatican II is trying to draw in all people who are drifting away from faith in general. But it remains true, Paul VI says, that some priests and members of the faithful mask with the name conciliar those personal interpretations and erroneous practices that are injurious, even scandalous, and at times sacrilegious. But these abuses cannot be attributed either to the council itself or to the reforms that have legitimately issued therefrom, but rather to a lack of authentic fidelity in their regard. You want to convince the faithful that the proximate cause of the crisis is more than a wrong interpretation of the council, and that it flows from the council itself. Moreover, you act as if you had a particular role in this regard. But the mission of discerning and remedying the abuses is first of all ours, the Pope's that is. It is the mission of all the bishops who work together with us. Indeed, we do not cease to raise our voice against these excesses, and he repeats some examples in which he has worked to counter these excesses in the 1970s. He says, finally, your behavior is contradictory. You want, so you say, to remedy the abuses that disfigure the Church. You regret that authority in the Church is not sufficiently respected. You wish to safeguard authentic faith, esteem for the ministerial priesthood, and fervor for the Eucharist in its sacrificial and sacramental fullness. Such zeal would, in itself, merit our encouragement, since it is a question of exigencies which, together with evangelization and the unity of Christians, remain at the heart of our preoccupations and of our mission. But how can you at the same time, in order to fulfill this role, claim that you are obliged to act contrary to the recent council in opposition to your brethren in the episcopate, to distrust the Holy See itself, which you call the Rome of the neo-modernist and neo-Protestant tendency, and to set yourself up in open disobedience to us? Let us come now to the more precise requests which you formulated during the audience of September 11th. You would like to see recognized the right to celebrate Mass in various places of worship according to the Tridentine Rite. You wish also to continue to train candidates for the priesthood according to your criteria as before the council, in seminaries apart as in a queen. What is indeed at issue is the question is your clearly proclaimed refusal to recognize in its whole the authority of the Second Vatican Council and that of the Pope. This refusal is accompanied by an action that is oriented toward propagating and organizing what must indeed unfortunately be called a rebellion. In regard to the Pope, every Catholic admits that the words of Jesus to Peter determine also the charge of Peter's legitimate successors. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Feed my sheep. Confirm your brethren. The First Vatican Council specified in these terms the assent due to the sovereign pontiff. The pastors of every rank and of every rite, and the faithful, each separately and all together, are bound by the duty or hierarchical subordination and of true obedience, not only in questions of faith and morals, but also in those that touch upon the discipline and government of the Church throughout the entire world. Thus, by persevering the unity of communion and of profession of faith with the Roman Pontiff, the Church is a single flock under one pastor. Such is the doctrine of Catholic truth, from which no one can separate himself without danger for his faith and his salvation. Each bishop is indeed an authentic teacher for preaching to the people entrusted to him that faith which must guide their thoughts and conduct and dispel the errors that menace the flock. But by their nature, the charges of teaching and governing cannot be exercised except in hierarchical communion with the head of the college, the Pope, and with its members. A fortiori, a single bishop without a canonical mission does not have an actu expeditu ad agendum, the faculty of deciding in general what the rule of faith is, or of determining what tradition is. In practice, you are claiming that you alone are the judge of what tradition embraces. It is up to the Pope and to councils to exercise judgment in order to discern in the traditions of the Church that which cannot be renounced without infidelity to the Lord and to the Holy Spirit, the deposit of faith, and that which on the contrary can and must be adapted to facilitate the prayer and the mission of the Church throughout a variety of times and places, in order to better translate the divine message into the language of today and better to communicate it, without an unwarranted surrender of principles. Assent is owed not only to dogmas, that's very important. Again, you cannot appeal to the distinction between what is dogmatic and what is pastoral, to accept certain texts of this council and to refuse others. Indeed, not everything in the council requires an assent of the same nature. Only what is affirmed by definitive acts as an object of faith or as truth related to faith requires an assent of faith or absolute submission. But the rest also forms part of the solemn magisterium of the Church, to which each member of the faithful owes a confident acceptance and a sincere application. Lefebvre did not capitulate to Pope Paul VI's letter. He may have expressed regrets from time to time for poor wording in his sermons or in his declaration. He affirmed that he did not intend to condemn the person of Paul VI himself, even though he did in his declaration, but his intention was to help guide and provide sacramental ordination for the movement of traditionalists, which again he did not consider himself to be the founder of. Lefebvre, however, never recanted any element of his declaration, which is especially problematic because this document remains the sort of source text for the modern traditionalist movement, especially in the SSPX. If he was expressing regret over certain wordings, which wordings in this document should in fact not be considered as foundational to the SSPX. A number of letters were exchanged between Paul VI and Lefebvre for the remainder of Paul VI's papacy. No concessions or capitulations were made by either party, and Lefebvre was not excommunicated by Pope Paul VI, despite his statements that, Pope Paul VI's magisterium was a neo-modernist or a neo-Protestant magisterium. But in 1988, when Lefebvre was 83, he began to move forward with the episcopal ordination of 4 bishops. According to SSPX sources, negotiations with the Vatican frequently indicated that a papal mandate would authorize these ordinations, but were continually delayed. John Paul II explicitly forbid him to ordain these bishops without a papal mandate, and Lefebvre was informed explicitly that doing so would incur his own automatic excommunication. John Paul II articulated that the illicit and expressly disobedient ordination of these 4 bishops contradicted Canon 13282 and 1013. Lefebvre, however, believed that this automatic excommunication did not occur because of Canon 1324, which says that no one is liable to a penalty when violating a law if they acted under the compulsion of grave fear, because he gravely feared that the Church's traditions would be lost if he did not ordain these 4 bishops. This was the official position of the members of the SSPX until 2008, which believed that their bishops had not ever been excommunicated, even though Pope John Paul II did in fact explicitly excommunicate them. They, however, later petitioned the Holy See for the lifting of the ban of excommunication over the surviving bishops due to the, quote, grave distress that caused them, indicating that they were in fact of the belief that the excommunication at least had probably occurred because they were asking the Pope to remove it. Now, participants in the SSPX in general have never been automatically excommunicated, because in the post-conciliar Church, the Holy See has opted to use the penalty of excommunication as a way to describe someone's canonical state if they are not in submission to Rome, rather than as a punitive tool to get them to submit to a particular decision. To be clear, the Holy See recognizes that the SSPX exercises no legitimate canonical ministry. We saw that in Paul VI's discourses with Lefebvre. Therefore, all priests a part of her, in the Holy See's view, engage in the sinful action of illicit sacramental ministry, apart from the ministry of reconciliation and holy matrimony, because both of these faculties were extended to the SSPX by Pope Francis. Engaging in the public administration of the Holy Eucharist or any other sacraments is canonically akin to a priest who has had his faculties removed from doing so, from engaging in these sacraments, even though they were told by their bishop not to engage in them. All priests can morally only exercise the priestly ministries when granted the faculties to do so by their local ordinary. SSPX bishops are validly ordained and extend these faculties, but they are not licitly ordained, and so they do not even have the ability to extend the faculty to celebrate ministry, because no SSPX bishops have a valid ministry in the Church today. The reason that the Vatican has not excommunicated each priest in the SSPX, or lay people that take part in SSPX chapels, is out of the caution that particular members of the SSPX society or lay people associated with them may indeed only be participating in the society out of a valid desire to celebrate the traditional Roman rite. If this desire is the cause for which a person entered the society, their membership in the society does not in and of itself separate them from the church entirely and place them in a state of schism. However, even in this circumstance, willingness to enter the SSPX and exercise illicit priestly ministry constitutes sinful matter. SSPX priests are relying on the subjective culpability of sin being reduced by what they believe are the circumstances which coerce them into engaging in an explicitly disobedient ministry. SSPX then is referred to as canonically irregular because some of its priests may be in communion with Rome, but the society they belong to functionally is not subjected to the papacy. They do not take orders from the Pope, basically. The SSPX will not do what the Pope tells them to do unless they want to do it all on their own. So functionally speaking, the SSPX does not accept the authority of the Pope over their society. And since the SSPX has not been authorized by the Vatican, they are canonically irregular. Now, in response to a 1996 inquiry whether or not attending an SSPX chapel mass would fulfill a Sunday obligation, the Vatican responded that yes, you would fulfill your Sunday obligation by attending a mass offered by a priest of the Society of St. Pius X. It stipulated, however, that the person attending this mass should have the intention to simply participate in the traditional Latin Mass for the sake of devotion, which would not be a sin. Now, attending the Mass would meet your obligation for attending Mass because you did, in fact, attend a validly celebrated Mass. Now, the Mass did not operate licitly, however, because the priest celebrating it did not possess licit faculties given from a bishop who was in a regular position with the Vatican. Now, ironically, the reason that the SSPX gets this treatment of regularly being referred to as, yes, this does fulfill your Sunday obligation, and the reason that SSPX priests in general are not excommunicated is because of this notion that's ironically popular after Vatican II of partial communion. Of course, the SSPX possesses a great degree of partial communion. It lacks the full subjection or the full submission to the papacy, so it does lack the oneness of the universal church. When you attend a Mass held in SSPX chapel, the relationship of that chapel to the universal church, it certainly lacks the fullness of oneness, which is one of the necessary marks of the church. To have full union with the Pope is to be fully a part of the one church. Because the SSPX does not accept the juridical authority of the Pope, they do not fully possess this mark of the church. But because it's so closely aligned with the Catholic Church in her teachings, in her traditions, and does, in theory, accept the authority of the Pope, although not in practice, because of this notion of a sort of spectrum of communion with the Church, which the SSPX would reject, the SSPX would draw more of a hard line. You're either in the Catholic Church or you're not. They probably don't like that change in emphasis since Vatican II of there being a sort of spectrum of communion. But because of that notion of a sort of spectrum of communion, that's why Vatican rulings about the SSPX seem to be somewhat unclear, whether or not they are or are not a part of the true church. SSPX apologetics typically center defenses against the charge of schism by focusing on whether or not the act of illicitly and expressly disobediently consecrating 4 bishops was in and of itself, considering Canon 1324, an act of schism. However, that is largely beside the point, because you'll have to forgive me for not having the slideshow on there. That's kind of odd. So the reason that's beside the point is that schism is not directly related to whether or not illicitly consecrating bishops in and of itself is an act of schism. Schism is simply defined as the sin of actively separating yourself from the universal church. This could take place in a variety of ways. A bishop of a diocese might declare that his entire diocese is no longer in communion with the Church of Rome, as was and continues to be the case with so many of the Eastern churches. Happily, many of them have restored communion with Rome. These are the Eastern Rite Catholic churches. Schism is a sin that could also be committed by an individual who separates themselves from the universal church by receiving initiation into a so-called Orthodox or Protestant body, thus separating themselves from the canonical jurisdiction of the successor of St. Peter by submitting themselves to the jurisdiction of their new ecclesial body, whether that's an Orthodox church or a Protestant ecclesial body. However, if somebody simply says, I do not personally accept the authority of the Pope over my own moral life, or institutionally, if the SSPX says we do not accept the authority of the Pope over the decisions of our society, that is also the sin of schism. Schism could also be described not as a sin, which God only knows the subjective culpability for, but as an objective state, either of an individual, a local church, an ecclesial body, or a priestly society, as is the case with the SSPX. This would be the state in which a particular institution does not exist within the boundaries of the universal church, which is practically observed as whether or not that institution exists under the juridical authority and submits itself to the juridical authority of the Pope as its universal head. The Pope is the visible source of unity of all Christians, not merely by rallying the troops or being a sort of symbolic figurehead like a European monarch, like a King George of England, but the Pope is the visible source of unity of all Christians by being the juridical leader of all Christians, because all Christians look to the same leader as our foundation of faith. That is what unifies us all, because we have one leader. In the same manner that our country was not truly united, the United States, that is, if you're American, was not truly united until the Constitution was written, and then we had a president who was a firm leader of our country that really united us. In the same manner, Jesus established the church to have one juridical head who would unite all Christians by his authority over all of us in matters of faith and moral, but also other prudential matters. The sin of schism is the subjective act of not submitting oneself to the juridical, prudential, doctrinal, and moral authority of the Pope and all bishops in communion with him. Now, the culpability for this sin can be mitigated by external circumstances. The SSPX argues that, yes, they are in a state that is not favorable, but they feel they must be in such a state of active resistance of the Pope's authority because of grave circumstances requiring them to resist him. However, whether or not SSPX members are correct that they should be in this state of schism, are they committing a personal sin of schism? Only the Lord knows, but we can conjecture. But at the same time, they are objectively in a state of schism because they do not accept the authority of the Pope over their society. Well, as Pope Paul VI referenced in his letter, the words of Vatican I declare that the Roman Church possesses a superiority of ordinary power over all other churches, and that this power of jurisdiction of the Roman Pontiff, which is truly episcopal, is immediate, to which all, of whatever right and dignity, both pastors and faithful, both individually and collectively, are bound by their duty of hierarchical subordination and true obedience, to submit not only in matters which belong to faith and morals, but also in those that appertain to the discipline, such as the liturgy, and government of the Church throughout the world, so that the Church of Christ may be one flock under one supreme pastor, through the preservation of unity, both of communion and of profession of the same faith with the Roman Pontiff. This is the teaching of Catholic truth, from which no one can deviate without loss of faith and salvation. So the Pope does have universal authority over all disciplines of the Church, and to submit yourself to the Pope and to be Catholic is to accept his decisions regarding the disciplines of the Church or the liturgy, as well as the matters regarding faith and morals. This is declared as a dogma here. If anyone shall say that the Roman Pontiff has the office merely of inspection or direction, and not the full and supreme power of jurisdiction over the universal Church, not only in things which belong to faith and morals, but also in those which relate to the discipline and government of the Church spread throughout the world, or assert that he possesses merely the principal part and not all the fullness of this supreme power, or that this power which he enjoys is not ordinary and immediate, both over each and all the churches, and over each and all the pastors and the faithful, let him be anathema. So to deny the Pope's authority is to be a heretic. It is a dogma of the faith. Does the SSPX accept that the Roman Pontiff has the full and supreme power of jurisdiction over their society? If yes, they are within the boundaries of the Catholic Church and are not in a state of schism. But if they do not accept the Pope's full and supreme power of jurisdiction, not only regarding faith and morals, but also regarding disciplines over their society, they are in the state of schism. And insofar as they believe it is not necessary to submit to the Pope's authority regarding disciplines, faith, and morals, if they do believe this is not necessary to be a Catholic, then they are in fact contradicting a dogma of the faith, and this is in fact a heresy. And in fact, all schisms are the result of some sort of heresy. The SSPX does not in fact answer to the Pope as an institution. The SSPX believes they have a legitimate reason to fear that if they should submit to the Pope's juridical authority, the Catholic tradition would fail to be transmitted. The legitimacy of this fear is the crux of the entire question of the moral culpability of the SSPX state of independence, or their objective state of schism from Rome. Are they morally culpable for this objective state of schism, or is Rome morally culpable for their objective state of schism? Regardless of their moral culpability, the society does in fact will to exist outside of the Pope's jurisdiction and is in an objective state of schism. If the SSPX legitimately submitted to the authority of the Pope, the answer to the following questions would be yes. Would they accept a Vatican appointment of this or that bishop to be the new superior general of their society? No, they would not accept a Vatican appointment. They want to choose for themselves. Would they accept Vatican juridical demands on their seminary instruction if the Vatican said you must teach a course on this? No, they want to determine their own seminary instruction. If the Vatican ordered the SSPX seminaries to teach their seminarians how to celebrate the TLM as well as the Novus Ordo rites as a precondition for accepting full ecclesial recognition, would the SSPX do this? Would they accept this condition to be in full communion with the Church and have ecclesial recognition of their society? If the Vatican offered regularization, if the SSPX offered one Novus Ordo liturgy a week at each chapel, would they do this? If the Vatican asked the SSPX to concelebrate in a Novus Ordo celebration at the Vatican, would they obey this order? Does the SSPX in general accept the canonization of saints such as Paul VI, John the 23rd, or John Paul II? In general, no. However, each priest is free to make their own decisions because there is no formal magisterium of the SSPX. But in general, members of the SSPX, whether the priestly society or lay people associated with them, do not accept the canonizations of Post-Vatican II saints. Arguing this is not dogmatic, I can only find arguments that canonizations of saints are not dogmatic by SSPX members. In general, theologians accept that canonizations of saints are dogmatic. If the Vatican suppressed the 1962 Missal in general and forbid its use in favor of a sort of 2042 traditional Latin Missal, which integrated 90% TLM with 10% Novus Ordo reforms, would the SSPX accept that the 1962 Missal had been abrogated, and would they accept this 2042 traditional Latin Missal, which had some elements of the reform? If the Vatican offered full regularization of the SSPX, if they submitted a formal statement which indicated that they accepted the authority of Vatican II in general, would they do this? Inasmuch as the SSPX has indicated that it would like its society to exist outside of the juridical authority of the Pope, which includes submitting to decisions they don't like, the society is in fact in a state of schism, or refusal to submit to Rome. To say, I shall submit to the Pope whenever I agree with him, is in fact to not submit at all. The SSPX is gambling with their salvations by believing that present circumstances require them to refuse to submit their society to Rome's authority in general. Of course, an SSPX priest may respond that submitting to the authority of Rome is to gamble with one's salvation because of how much Rome has erred in their opinion. I, however, would hedge my bets with obedience and submission rather than independence and revolution. There is no precedent in church history of anyone being correct to refuse to submit to the authority of the Pope, although there are many examples of people doing just that. The SSPX USA District's website states, quote, "It can happen that an order contrary to reason or injurious to the common good might be given by the legitimate authority. If an individual comes to realize that the law is harmful, he must not obey, for it is not in truth a law but a tyranny." This is the SSPX justification for scrutinizing every decision of the papal authority and determining for themselves which decrees are worth obedience. The danger of this attitude, of course, is that it conflates differences in personal opinion with grave errors that absolutely cannot be reconciled with logic. Many traditionalists seem to come to the idea that if I simply don't agree with the decision of the Vatican, I'm not required to obey it because it's illogical. But very often, the Vatican comes to conclusions which are in fact logical. It's very rare for the Vatican to say anything that anyone could really say is an utterly illogical conclusion. Very, very rare. Generally what happens is the Vatican looks at the same data that traditionalists look at, the Vatican comes up with one logical conclusion, and traditionalists may say, I disagree with that conclusion, I've come to a different conclusion. That is in fact a difference in opinion, not a different application of logic in general. To say, once again, I accept that the Pope is the legitimate successor of St. Peter, but he should be resisted in his juridical degrees and theological moral instruction in general, because the popes have so grievously erred after a given point in history, is not the Catholic understanding of the papacy, but the Orthodox understanding of the papacy. Now, in 1988, a number of SSPX priests approached John Paul II to ask for a regularization of their status in the establishment of a society which could be accepted by the juridical authority of the Pope. These societies, formed of the Ecclesia Dei Commission, were an offshoot of the SSPX, which explicitly accepted the juridical authority of the Pope. A number of the members of the SSPX believed that eventually an agreement would be reached with the Vatican. When it became clear that this was not going to happen with the SSPX, a number of these priests jumped ship, left the SSPX, and formally submitted to the Pope and asked that he would provide them with a community in which they could continue to practice their charism. The Ecclesia Dei Commission was founded after the excommunication of Lefebvre and his 4 bishops, in order to establish norms for communities which wished to exercise the liturgy of 1962. Societies or communities whose charism is dependent on the Ecclesia Dei Commission are thus called the Ecclesia Dei communities. The Fraternal Society of St. Peter, founded in 1988, and the Institute of Christ the King and Sovereign Priest, founded in 1990, are especially noted for their charism's close association with that of the SSPX, exclusively celebrating the liturgy and customs as popular before Vatican II. Other societies also practice the traditional Latin Mass and the 1962 liturgy in general, and typically they center their orders around traditional piety, but may have varying openness to the use of the Novus Ordo liturgy. These communities include the Institute of the Good Shepherd, Missionaries of the Holy Cross, the Institute of St. Philip Neri, and the Order of St. Elijah, founded in 2016. A number of monastic communities, priories of the Dominican Order, and Third Order societies of the Franciscan Order also celebrate the TLM, generally alongside the Novus Ordo. There are also a number of societies which are connected with the SSPX and exercise the Franciscan, the Dominican, and the Benedictine charism. These would include the Roman Catholic Society of Pope Leo XIII, the Servants of the Holy Family, the Monastery of St. Benedict Brignoles Frejus Toulon. There are also a number of sedevacantist societies which have formed, which explicitly reject that there is a pope at all. Let us turn our attention now to sedevacantist ecclesiology, which was also principally formed in response to the Novus Ordo Mass. What is the correct approach for traditionalists moving forward who hope to see the re-implementation of many of the lost traditions which seem to have been forgotten by so many pastors and so many institutions of the Catholic Church since the 1960s? For starters, it must be acknowledged that the present leadership of the Church came of age during the implementation of the Vatican II reforms, and as young pastors, many of today's bishops were typically the ones overseeing the implementation of these reforms. As we've talked about, many of the reforms of the 1960s and 70s were not really decreed from above, but were instituted illicitly at the parish level by these pastors who are today the world's bishops, and were later legitimized by Pope Paul VI. Traditionalism, then, is perceived as a rejection of the life's work of many of today's bishops. Many bishops respond to young traditionalists today just as they responded when they were young pastors to the remnants of the old traditionalism of the older generations in the 1970s. Except they do so with more bewilderment, because this doesn't really make sense that today's young people would be behaving in the same way that older generations behaved in the 1970s. In response, many young people have been drawn to so-called resistance podcasts on online spaces. These efforts to restore tradition in the Church, however, through a sort of resistance or rebellious spirit, are in fact futile. You cannot ever stage a successful rebellion in the Catholic Church. The only way to hope to see desired reforms implemented is to convince, through persuasion and cooperation, the Church's leadership to implement them themselves. The Church is entirely hierarchical in her constitution, and therefore nothing happens that the leadership of the Church does not desire to do. In the 20th century, in this series, we saw that the revolutionary reforms, such as the liturgical movement and the biblical movement and the ecumenical movement, were implemented by reform-minded Catholics who first propagated their ideas in learning institutions and seminaries between the year 1900 and the 1940s, then gained the trust of the Church's leadership between the 40s and the 50s, and then eventually gained the unanimous support of the International Episcopate in the 1960s. Nowhere along the way did these reformers organize themselves as a party of resistance or a sort of rebellion. If they would have positioned themselves or framed themselves as rebellious to the Church's hierarchy, this would have been utterly suicidal to their cause. Today's bishops and the Holy Father the more that today's bishops and the Holy Father are made by traditionalists to perceive the traditionalist movement as a threat to them and their programs, the less and less influence this movement will ultimately have over the trajectory of the church, even if the movement begins to have more and more success on online spaces. The more the traditionalist movement presents itself as a rebellion, the more suppressed it will become. This doesn't mean that traditionalist Catholics should simply be silent and worm their way upwards using deceptive tactics like we saw with certain members of the liturgical movement. It does, however, mean that traditionalist Catholics should emphasize, as the homilies posted on the YouTube channel Sensus Fidelium typically do, the Catholic faith in all of its fullness, rather than merely emphasizing present church politics. And traditionalist Catholics should seek to build relationship of cooperation with the church's hierarchy, because this is the only way to get your ideas accepted by them. Simply insulting or resisting them will not be effective at actually getting tradition restored. What should we do? Write a respectful letter to your bishop. I wouldn't say use flattery, but do tip the hat whenever you can to your pastor, to your bishops, just to let them know you do appreciate whatever you can appreciate about their ministries. You need to establish relationships with bishops if you want to ever try to suggest anything. And you need to establish a relationship of mutual respect and trust if you actually want to advocate for a restoration of tradition. You should invite your pastor of your local parish over for dinner. Even if you attend a more distant traditional Latin Mass, get to know the pastor who's in charge of your geographical area. Pray for your bishop, your local pastor, and your pope with genuine charity in your heart. We can and should, as much as possible, form respectful relationships with our living elders in the church. That is, the presbyterate, the priesthood, and the episcopacy, even if we do not see eye to eye with our pastors on all matters. Imagine, you're a working man or a working woman, if you are, and you have a boss. You very, very likely do not see eye to eye in every single matter with your boss. But if you respect your boss and you let them know you appreciate them in subtle and appropriate ways, and you genuinely just have charity for them, you like them as much as you possibly can, you try to have charity towards them and respect them, and most of all, you submit. You make it clear that you do respect their authority. Now you're able to develop a relationship with that boss, and you're able to actually have a positive impact on the direction of the company, even while you're not in charge. The boss still is in charge, and you have to accept that. That sort of hierarchical relationship of submission is even more appropriate when we consider our relationship with our bishop. Now consider if you disliked certain elements of what your boss was doing with the company, and so as a result, you try to help recruit other employees in your company to a sort of rebellious movement where you're going to resist the actions of your boss. What is going to happen? Do you think your boss is going to cooperate with you, capitulate to your demands, or are you simply going to be fired? You're going to be suppressed, and when you do, you should not act like a victim, because clearly you positioned yourself as a rebel, undermining the authority of the boss. Of course, the boss is going to suppress you. In the same manner, traditionalists should not, on the one hand, act as though they are rebellious and leading a resistance against the authority of the church, and then act surprised, or even less masculine, act like victims when you are suppressed. Rebels are always suppressed by the authority, and you shouldn't be surprised when that happens. If you position yourself in a manner that seeks to undermine the authority, of course the authority is not going to treat you, with total respect and cheer you on. The authority, of course, is going to suppress you. That's what you ask for when you undermine the authority. However, if relationships are established as much as possible with our authorities in the church, when we do feel we can, appropriately and respectfully, suggest a measured, attainable change, phrase our suggestions in a respectful manner, because this recognizes reality. Not merely engaging in flattery, but being respectful recognizes reality. It recognizes explicitly the reality that we do not have any authority in the church as lay people. Only the pastors have authority over their churches, and bishops over their dioceses, and the Pope over the universal church. When we make suggestions, if we ever feel it's appropriate to do so, we should also recognize it will likely be ignored. Yet simply phrasing our suggestions in a respectful manner over the long term can make a big difference in the way the church leadership perceives so-called trads. This is not a program so much for an infiltration, it's a plan to try to foster healthy relationships with pastors, even those which have seemed to have taken steps toward which have not in themselves seemed to have taken steps towards forming healthy relationships with you, you should still take steps towards forming healthy relationships in a state of submission towards them, because that is in fact what God wants us to do towards our hierarchs, even when our gestures might not be reciprocated. Additionally, we should refrain from outright trashing the Novus Ordo and the Vatican II reforms in general in online spaces. This continues to lead to the perception that the Traditionalist movement is opposed to the hierarchy, which once again is going to lead to suppression, whether or not it is or is not justified. It wouldn't seem honest or, once again, masculine to pivot from the bold revolutionary status to the poor, oppressed victim status, when the Church's authority, which trads often do insult, respond by punishing trads in general. Once again, to a non-religious person attending a Novus Ordo, even a Novus Ordo liturgy would seem to be laced with tradition, and this is often quite attractive to secular-minded individuals. In other words, it should be noted that the Novus Ordo reform did not dispense with tradition in general, and to indicate that the Novus Ordo eradicated tradition in general from the Church would be hyperbolic. If a secular person were to attend a TLM ceremony, they would likely find the ceremony to be utterly foreign. In this video, we have examined the modern traditionalist movement, its valid points and concerns found within it. One day we pray a reform of the reform will restore unnecessarily lost traditions, with the core ideas of the reform in a manner that will make a distinct traditionalist movement unnecessary, because it will rehabilitate many of the lost traditions of our Roman patrimony. In the meantime, of course, our vocation as laypeople is not to become anxious about the direction of Peter's bark with every decision that the boat's captain makes. It is to man our posts on the ship as best we can, becoming saints by the grace of God, if he so wills, and diving into the richness of church history to become fluent in sacred tradition. Let us conclude in prayer. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Pater noster qui es in celi, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum de nobis hodie, et dimite nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimitimus debitoribus nostris. Et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Thank you so much for watching. God bless you. See you next time. Bye.